Welcome to the second session of the second annual GRCC Peace Studies Conference. Very glad you all could be here. To welcome our first keynote speaker of the evening, we have a professor from the Social Science Department, Professor Susan Williams, Professor of European History.
All right, well, I'm really excited about this talk, so we'll get going. I'm here to introduce Dr. Karen Devine from Dublin City University in Ireland. Just to give you a little bit of her background, she has an MA in European Integration from the University of Limerick, a postgraduate diploma in statistics from the University of Dublin Trinity College, and a PhD in political science from the University of Dublin Trinity College. She has a variety of research interests focused on Irish neutrality and Irish public opinion, as well as European Union common foreign and security policies. She's published a number of articles, and I'll give you a couple of the titles, so you can look them up later and read them, including the Irish political party's positions on the European Union common foreign and security policy in Irish political studies, and a comparative critique of Irish neutrality in the unneutral discourse in Irish studies and international affairs. And today, Dr. Devine is giving a talk entitled Principles and Motivations Underpinning the Development of the European Union's Security and Defense Policy from Treaties to Practice. Please help me welcome her.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's a real pleasure. I, in particular, want to thank Bob Hendershot because Bob actually brings his Irish Studies group from GRCC over to Dublin. They come over to Ireland for a 3-week period, and at the end of their 3-week holiday and learning experience, they come to Dublin, and I give them a talk on the European Union. I think it probably is a little bit heavy going for them, but he assures me they really enjoy it. And it's always been a desire for me to come here to see what Grand Rapids is like. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I was just talking to one of my colleagues there, Siobhan. She was saying that she nearly left her laptop behind her at the security at the airport. Well, there's somebody else I have to thank as well for me being here, because I actually left my laptop on a very small island on the west coast of Ireland the day before I came here. I only realised when I was actually on the ferry, and I realised I'd left it back in this house where I'd been staying for 5 days. So I had to make a very quick phone call to see if the person in the house would come and bring my laptop. And I had to persuade the ferryman not to leave. It was the last ferry of the day. So if he left, my presentation would have been in Clare Island, and I would have been standing in front of you trying to crack jokes. So luckily, he said, well, I have very wet people downstairs in my ferry. So I went to talk to the wet people, and it turned out that they were Americans, and they were over for a brief day journey to the island. And half of them had relatives in Grand Rapids. So they said, we'll wait. So 5 minutes later, my laptop arrived. The ferryman was very unhappy, so I paid him an extra fare, and I left Clare Island with my presentation. So I just want to thank those people from Grand Rapids for holding up the ferry for me. But today, I'm going to talk about principles and motivations underpinning the development of the European security and defence policy from treaties to practice. I hope my accent isn't too strong and that you can bear with me. If I go too fast, just let me know, slow me down. So what I'm going to talk about is theories and approaches to trying to understand the European Union as a body that has the potential for conflict resolution. And I also want to thank Gordon. Where is he? There he is in the front row, because his talk is very relevant to this. He's actually explained all of the basic concepts that are part of this paper. So those of you who are here for Gordon's session will understand the othering and so forth, because I'm going to talk about the EU's identity as a normative power, because this is one of the bases of why the EU sees itself as a conflict resolution machine. And he also talked about othering, and that's what I'm going to look at, but from an internal perspective, because I'm going to discuss how the EU has othered member states internally with respect to the identity of the European Union. Not only does the European Union other those outside of its borders of 27 states, it has othered 4 small states within the European Union. And I think that has implications for our understanding of the EU as a conflict resolution machine. And neutrality was that other identity, which is part of my research agenda. And so I'm going to look at how the EU identity was completed through the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty is basically a series of amendments to the primary treaties that established the European Economic Community, the European Coal and Steel Community from the 50s and 60s, but it has culminated in the Constitution, which was drafted in 2004, but that failed. So then they made up the Lisbon Treaty to compensate for the Constitution, and that has been ratified. And in that Lisbon Treaty is the culmination, the seal on the EU's identity in terms of their tools to realise that identity. So I'll discuss that. And then I'm going to look in the second half of the presentation as to whether actions speak louder than words. So the EU has created a discourse of its own identity. And what I want to look at is whether the EU's behaviour actually matches up with that. So we will look at words and we'll look at deeds. So I'll look at the motivations that are said to underpin EU operations in Africa. I'll look at human security, or the concept of human security in European security and defence policy. I'll look at democracy promotion, and in particular the aid for democracy promotion in Africa. And I'll look at gender mainstreaming, so implementing the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which acknowledges a gender-based violence as a serious issue in war, as a war crime, and 1820, which followed on from that. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts. And I'll be very interested to see what you think of this argument that I'm proposing. There's a half an hour at the end for questions, but I can also take questions during as well. So if you do want to ask a question, please feel free to do so. So what I want to do is just to put this in a little bit of context, because the European Union project has been ongoing really since the end of the Second World War. And I found this interesting because Stephen Walt, who is a realist, an analyst, I think, of international relations here in the US, has said that he has 5 big questions. And the first question was about the European Union, where it is going. And this, to me, was interesting because I'm Irish, European as such, and for me to know that a very prominent American scholar, the first thing he's thinking of is about the European Union in terms of his priorities, that to me is interesting. And it's also interesting, although it's not surprising because he's a realist, as a theorist, but he's wondering about the re-emergence of genuine power politics within Europe. Power politics is going to be central to this presentation as we go along. And that's really what I'm asking in terms of what are the motivations for the EU to become a resolver of conflicts, a conflict resolution machine. Is it because it's a normative power, because it believes in the values that underpin its foreign policy, which is democracy, promotion of democracy, rule of law, human rights? Again, Gordon talked about these. Or is it really about power projection? So is the value simply a cloak for power projection? How do we know that? How can we know that? Because we're being told by the European Union, we really feel very strongly about these values, they underpin our policy. How do you know that that is actually the case? So we want to look at some behavior to see if the discourse matches with the behavior. And to do that, I'm going to use a theory. So have many of you, hands up, because there's a lot of students here, have many of you studied international relations theory or touched on it at all? A few hands? Yeah? Good. So the theoretical part of this is a development from realism and realism and liberalism to constructivism. How many of you have heard of constructivism? Alexander Wendt? A few? Yeah, great. So his constructivism is called conventional constructivism because he was really the first person to come up with this. So interests are central to realists. Why are interests central to realists? What do interests determine effectively? Anyone? Yeah. Yeah. Cause and effect. And what's the effect? What's the outcome of interests? What do you need interests for? What do they do effectively? They're the basis for what? Where you commit resources. Exactly. Policy. So interests are the basis for policy in the realist world. This is how the diagram looks. So states have interests, and it's on the basis of those national interests that they will formulate their policy to realize those national interests. However, Alex Bent came along and he said, well, I'm not sure if it's completely all about interests, because there's other things that make humans tick, and realism in a way sees states as a human. So he feels, well, you know, humans aren't just about interests, they're about other things. They're about love, they're about identity, they're about different things to fundamental costs and benefits evaluations. So he came up with the idea that identity, who you are, will inform what your interests are. And then interests will predict what your policy will be. So he put that at the beginning of that equation, modified realism, to say that. And he said identity is constituted by narratives. So this is a quotation. Identities are narratives of who they are, which in turn constitute the interests on the basis of which they make behavioral choices or policy. So it gets a bit interesting. However, for a critical constructivist, and that's what I am for my sins, we need to make some room in the theoretical landscape, because we're not entirely happy with Bent's approach to this. We think there's something more going on. And this is where the othering comes in. Because our concept of identity is very different to Bent's. Critical constructivists believe there isn't just one identity. There is an identity that is hegemonic or dominant. And within that, for it to be hegemonic or dominant, there has to be one that's been silenced or that's subjugated. We don't hear about it, but it's there. And it's the other. It's the subjugated other to the dominant identity. So that's where we have values do inform identity, but within that there's a hegemonic identity that is not quite equivalent to the other. It's similar, but it's better. Again, Gordon talked about this. It's a better, stronger identity. And that identity informs interests and policy and behavior. But for critical constructivists who are informed by post-structures like Derrida and Foucault, French theorists, there's one big thing that's missing still from this theoretical picture. Does anyone know what it is? Because critical constructivists believe something happens here, something happens here to cause one identity to be dominant over the other. Something happens here when that dominant identity is translated into interests, and something happens here, how interests are translated to policy and behavior, and it even happens here at the end. Does anyone know what that is? Any guesses? Yeah. Conflict. Good. Yes, it is. What about conflict, but not necessarily violence? Another word for that. An everyday word. Reform. Yeah, good. Any others? Yes, argument, exactly. Any more?
Competition.
Yeah. Yeah, ideology. Perfect.
Exploitation.
Yeah. My word begins with P. Close. Politics. We forget about politics. Critical constructivists see politics everywhere. It screams at them. Whereas conventional constructivists say, well, here's the EU, here's its identity. It's a normative power, it's into all of these values, and it has a foreign policy, and it goes out and does things, and that's pretty much the end of the story. But for critical constructivists, the story begins way at the beginning. And that's why the politics is in there in big letters, because really, for a critical constructivist, the values that the EU comes to actually take on is a political act. It's an act of politics. And so when I do my research, a lot of people think, oh, you know, she must be anti the EU because I take a critical perspective. But I'm not criticizing the EU, but I am looking at multiple perspectives. That's what a critical theorist does. It looks at multiple perspectives. And the reason why you'd look at multiple perspectives is because you see the politics at play. You know that there's various views on the particular problem or various views of what that identity consists of, but there's only one that everybody really hears about, and that's as a result of politics. And that's what critical constructivists are fundamentally interested in their research. And it's simply just how we're made, rather than anything ideological. So I'm going to talk about normative power. Gordon already said it was created by Ian Manners in 2002. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's created in 2002, because in 2002 the European Commission launched a strategy for the first time that added Europe as a global actor into its public diplomacy budget. There's various, I suppose, guesstimates of how much the EU spends on its public diplomacy budget. There's a think tank that estimates it's 2.4 billion annually, which is more than what Coca-Cola spends in a year worldwide on its advertising, marketing, and so forth. That's a lot. I think that's probably an overestimation. It is, I suppose, an aggregate of not just public diplomacy activities, but other activities within that. But it's potentially up to that figure of 2.4 billion. And Europe as a global actor was added in 2002. And the academic discourse started in 2002. Because a critical constructivist would see, they would always want to know the source of a discourse, or the source of what is said. So because the EU funds a lot of academics, for example, through a Jean Monnet program, they spend about 5 million a year. There's over 700 universities who actually receive this funding, and that gives about just over 2,000 permanent modules being taught at universities on the EU. And it is to not just teach the EU, but in a way to promote it as well. So that critical aspect of constructivism comes in, because the critical constructivists would view some academics, if they're funded by the EU, as maybe not as independent as ones that are not funded by the EU. And they would guess that what the academic is saying is going to cohere with what the EU is saying. They'll be pretty much on the same page. But Ian Manners coined this term normative power Europe, and it's the dedication to principles that are common. And he said that the basis of this identity is the values of democracy, promotion, the rule of law, human rights, and so forth. But these are norms, and these norms have been institutionalized. In other words, these are the norms that don't just inform the EU's foreign policy, but they inform how the EU actually does its business internally, how it makes decisions. Because it makes legislation, an enormous amount of legislation every year, which every member state must transpose into its own national legislative body and to adhere to them. So he's arguing that these norms are part of the internal identity of the EU, and therefore they're going to be part of the external identity. He also says that it's a means to achieve values more than material interests. This is at the core of the concept. And he introduces the idea of civilian power as well, which Gordon had talked about. So this identity is basically Europe as a peace project, because they argue that because, and again, Gordon mentioned this, France and Germany had 3 wars against each other, major wars within the last century. And essentially, the fact that so many states within Europe were at war for so long, the EU has arisen out of the ashes of that conflict to become what it is. So therefore, they position themselves of, look, we've been conflict-ridden, really for centuries, and now here we are. We're at peace. In fact, we cooperate with each other, and we've tied our economies together. That's amazing, given our past. But they use that then to say that others want to be like us. Again, Gordon had mentioned this. There's 5 aspects to this discourse on Europe as a peace project that translates internally but also externally. Solana said in April 2002 that ours is a common foreign policy but not a single policy. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that later. He says there's an internal demand in terms of public opinion. He looks at opinion poll data, which asks people in Europe across all of the member states, what do you think of the European Union? Is it good or a bad thing? Is it good for your country or bad for your country? Do you support the common foreign and security policy, common security and defence policy, and so forth? And he said, reading those polls, he believes there's a demand for a common foreign and security policy and for the EU to take on the role of a global actor. But he doesn't say who's necessarily making the call for the EU to become a global actor. The third one is that other states want to adopt EU values and objectives. So Romano Prodi was head of the European Commission. Javier Solana was head of, effectively High Representative for the foreign policy for the EU before Catherine Ashton. And so during this era in the early 2000s, they were producing these discourses on the common security and defence policy and also arguing that other states see the EU as it sees itself. So the EU sees itself as a normative actor. Other states outside of the EU also see it as a normative actor. And it's interesting to evaluate these. And the final one is that the EU behaves externally as it does internally. Again, this goes back to the idea of the norms that I talked about. These norms have become institutionalized according to Ian Manners. So the EU does what it does because of those norms inside the EU, and it happens outside as well. So that's what we're going to look at to see if this is necessarily the case. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the internal and external. And the reason why I'm going to focus on that is because I spent about 16, 17 years now looking at Irish neutrality. And I did my PhD on public opinion on Irish neutrality. And being Irish, being part of a very small state on the periphery of Western Europe, having a very long history, and being different from every other European continental state, including our neighbours, Great Britain, as a colony. We were colonised by Britain. You all heard of the 800 years of oppression. Well, Ireland was colonised, and it differs from every other European Union member state in that respect, excepting if you want to talk about the enlargements in 2004. But in terms of that EU 15, we were different. And Irish people are very sensitive about their sovereignty because they only got it in the 1930s, really. And when you've only recently got the chance to rule yourselves, you're very reluctant to let it go. It's why Norway has never joined the EU. It's why Switzerland hasn't joined the EU. It's a really precious thing when you haven't had it for so long and then you get it. And so I'm very aware, because I look at public opinion, and people, I remember when I was doing my dissertation and people would say, what are you doing it on? And we'd be in the pub, and they'd then just wax lyrical for 2 hours as to why we should hold on to our neutrality. And they explained all of the reasons why. It's in some of my research. I'm not going to go into it in this particular presentation, but this is the reason why I was sensitive to what the EU was doing internally. And there's another reason as well, because the Irish Constitution is the only one that says in Article 6 that all power derives from the people. So the government has power derived from the people, under God, it says. And therefore, the people have the ultimate right, or the ultimate say. They are the ultimate decision makers in terms of national policy. And because of that, if we want to change our constitution to bring in a new policy, divorce was brought in. We had a referendum in 1998 which brought divorce in. Previously there was no divorce. So if you want to change Irish policy and it's in the constitution, you have to change the constitution. To do that, you have to ask the Irish people, so you hold a referendum, and it's legally binding. Again, we're unique in that respect. So that's why everybody's very political in Ireland. Everybody has their views, and that's why when you go to the pubs, politics is a big thing that people talk about. And the drunker they get, the louder they get, and the more intense they get. But that's how Irish people are. So this informed my research aspect for this, just to explain a little bit about that. So what did Javier Solana say that is relevant to what we're trying to test here? He said, it's my belief that in this global age, a union of our size with our interests, history and values has an obligation to assume its share of responsibilities. I'm convinced that the same reasons that give the European Union responsibilities, our size and our interests, our history and values, also equip us to take responsibilities. And the question, therefore, is not whether we play a global role, but how we play that role. So, in other words, the EU's identity forms the basis for the EU to act externally. So, who you are is used as the basis for what you do. It's not a question of whether, it's how. It's determined. It's predetermined because of our identity. That's a big thing to say to a critical constructivist, because internally it doesn't necessarily make sense. It's one of these, we're big, therefore we will act. That's a realist assumption. Not necessarily. You could be big and not act. So he goes on to say this sense of shared responsibility for the fate of our planet is reflected in the pressure from leaders and public alike for more effective Europe in key policy areas, notably the environment and foreign policy. And he said, opinion polls throughout the EU consistently tell us that the CFSP is among the most broadly supported of EU policies. And from outside Europe, we are increasingly encouraged to play a fuller part in international affairs. What I'm trying to get here is who's been doing the asking? Because he has said public opinion and Eurobarometer, but interestingly, security and defence has always had the lowest level of support. In Ireland, it never went above 50%, only recently. For the rest of Europe, the average is around sort of 60%. And what they did just before the constitution was being drafted was that they actually changed the question wording, because they ask about foreign policy, security policy, and defence policy. And the foreign and security policy always attracted about 75% support, but the defence and security policy attracted around 50 to 60. So in 2002, I think it was, they changed the question wording, because the foreign policy was the key that would, I suppose, which was more agreeable. So they started asking about, do you support the EU's foreign and defence policy? And there's a sudden surge in the data, because if you track it, it's quite consistent, and then it jumps up on this graph, because I was puzzled as to why this was the case. So I went and I looked at the questionnaire. They changed the question wording. So they ask about a foreign and defence policy, which the EU does not actually have. It has a foreign and security policy and a security and defence policy. So in a way, the use of Eurobarometer is political in terms of the support for this. However, they say there's a demand for Europe linked to our know-how and regional integration, our readiness to address humanitarian crisis, and the values of inclusiveness and social tolerance that are common to our countries. So he's now talking about inclusiveness, tolerance, and common values. And he's saying our aim must be to match this demand with an adequate offer. So he's saying, look, these people, we're being asked to do this. We're being put in a position. We're big. We're being asked to do this. Outside people are asking us to do it. Inside people are asking us to do this. So there's this impetus towards it. He says the idealism behind the EU's foundation is vital to defining who and what we are today. So this again is to do with the resolution of conflicts after world wars. It helps to appreciate the value of the European Union as a force for good in the world. So now the EU is, again, because of its history, quite simply a force for good in the world. It's a little bit tautological and controversial, I suppose, for a critical theorist. We have carefully built a zone of peace, democracy, and the rule of law of more than 500 million people, which is a tremendous achievement, undoubtedly. And he says, now we have to extend that zone further. Again, the imperative is there. We have to. There's no choice. And to answer the call, again, we don't know where it's coming from, but there is a call for Europe to act, to promote peace and to protect the vulnerable, and that is the aim of the Common Foreign and Security Policy. He said it may be hard for some to imagine that in Asia, Africa and Latin America, people speak with great admiration of the European experience. We know that creating a self-sustaining peace is hard. We did so in the Balkans and in Aceh in Indonesia, and we're trying to do so in the Middle East, Darfur and elsewhere. In many ways, he says, the European Union is one big mediation and conflict resolution machine based on law and non-stop negotiations. So this is part of, fundamentally, the EU's identity, that it is a resolver of conflicts, and it's interesting to explore. He said this puts us in a position not only to advocate preventive diplomacy, but also to implement it. So again, this identity is saying we must act, we will act, and it'll even tell us how to act. It's almost like the EU is being born with the skills to resolve conflict because of its history. So, one last thing to finish off the theory bit. Does anyone know what that is? It's a bit small, but it's a rock. Yes, it's a rock. Okay, so we've named it as a rock. What else could you say about it? If you wanted to understand more about it, yeah? What were you going to say? Yeah. What about the content of it? How it came to be? How did the rock come to be? Pressure over time. Yes. So we've different, I suppose, types of rock. Okay? You encounter a rock, it's something you can stub your toe on and be very unhappy about it. Or you could call it an indefinite mixture of natural occurring substances, and there's three types. There's igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. But those names tell us how those rocks came to be. So when you see a rock, it's a very ordinary thing, it's just a rock. But the interesting thing for a geologist, well, it's a fascination. It's how it came to be. So the rock, to most of us, well, to me, it's just something I stubbed my toe on. And I ignore. But for a geologist, it's something, there's more to it, because they are fascinated with the process of how it came to be. So this rock has more meaning for them, in other words. And I want to explore this a little bit deeper. So any of you who are into sport, do you know who achieved a career super slam, winning all 4 Grand Slams, the Olympic singles gold medal, ATP World Tour finals, and a year-end #1 ranking in 1 year? So they know the sport, first of all. Tennis. Who achieved that? He's an American. Agassi. Great. Did anyone read Agassi's book, Open? Has anyone read that? No? Right, that's what I was going to ask you. What's the significance of that achievement? If you read the book, you would know that Andre Agassi hates tennis. Hated tennis his whole life. He was, as a child, brought out onto the tennis court and made practice by his dad, who invented this machine that would fire balls at him. And he hit 3,000 balls before he was allowed to go in to the house and have a sandwich after school, do his homework or whatever. Andre Agassi hated tennis. So if you read that statistic of what he did, it becomes more meaningful when you realize how much he hated tennis. And that's what I want to explore here. I'll get to it. There's another one here. Who's the rider who has won Tour de France 7 times? Lance Armstrong, American. Did anybody read his book? Is there anything remarkable about that statistic other than nobody else has done it? He had cancer, exactly. He had cancer that almost killed him just before he achieved these amazing feats. So again, it's an amazing feat, but when you understand the values of Lance Armstrong, who he was as a person, how he overcame cancer to actually make this achievement, it becomes more meaningful. Yeah? Last one there. Who has won 15 Olympic gold medals more than anyone in history? Michael Phelps. Very good. Swimmer. Did you read his book? Did anyone read his book? Again, the significance of his story and what he went through. He talks about his training regimes, everything. That is what makes this even more meaningful. So most of us, and I have to confess, I haven't read this book either, most of us would be like, yeah, that's great, 14 Olympic gold medals. But the book tells you what he went through to actually win them. So my point here is that when you know the history of how something came to be, it's more, you understand it better, it's more meaningful. And in a way, to tell the story of how the EU managed to complete this security and defence identity through the Lisbon Treaty by including what's known as a mutual defence clause. That's what MDC I'm talking about there. Mutual defence clause, it's in the Washington Treaty that formed NATO. It's Article 5. So if one or more of the parties suffer an armed attack, all others will come to their aid and assistance. And in terms of the Western European Union, which I'm going to talk about, they say by all means in your power. So I'll explain that. However, the point here is that if I can tell you the story of how the Mutual Defence Clause came to be in this treaty, which finalised the identity of the EU as a security actor. It will tell us something about the European Union. It'll tell us something about how it goes about getting what it wants. And for the purposes of this presentation, it gives us an indication of the credibility of its identity, of whether it's putting its own values into practice internally, and whether it does actually have the potential for a conflict resolution role. Okay. So, again, Goran had talked about this othering, and that's what I want to talk about now. What was the other to the EU's identity traditionally? Well, here's a newspaper from 1995. It's the Irish Times, and it says, on the right-hand side, it says, neutrals must join NATO, Kohl aid. So the German Chancellor Kohl, his aide, came to Dublin and was giving a foreign policy speech in which he said, all of the neutrals are going to have to join NATO at some point if you're a member of the European Union. This wouldn't have necessarily come as a big surprise. What he specifically said here was that the EU would only have a real security policy when it became the European arm of the Western Alliance. And what he means by that is when the EU merges with the Western European Union, which was a precursor to NATO. And I'll explain that in a minute. So he came to Ireland and he said neutrals must join NATO. And this isn't too much of a surprise, really, because in 1973, the foreign ministers of the EC issued a declaration on European identity. So we're going to know what it is to have a European identity here in terms of security and defence. There was a goal to achieve a political union, common attitudes and common actions, common positions in the sphere of foreign policy, coupled with NATO members' concept of security as provided by the nuclear weapons of the United States. So in other words, all of the original 6 members of the EEC were members of NATO, and for a very good reason. So European security depended on NATO, depended on the US guarantee. And there were plans for a European Union, the creation of a European identity, but they were intimately tied to the achievement of the common defence. Only once you have a common defence for Europe can you really say that you have a complete identity. So it's a little bit like a state. You know, is a state really a state if it doesn't have an army to protect itself, if it doesn't have a defence policy? And this was the ultimate part of a European identity. So returning to the other here of this identity, which is neutrality, because neutral states don't get involved in other countries' wars, are impartial in wars, want to retain their independence, and so they won't join a military alliance because they're afraid of that Article 5 guarantee, whereby if anyone else in the alliance gets attacked, they automatically have to come to their aid and assistance. And in the case of the WU, it's by all means in your power. It's a scary thing for a small state that has just got its independence because they're afraid of getting sucked in to power politics. They're afraid of eventually having to go and fight a war for France and Germany when really that war would be started for their interests rather than small states' interests. And they're not going to care what small states actually think about the conflict, how it's going to be conducted. So always very wary of actually joining a military alliance, which is why Austria, Sweden, Finland and Ireland have always been neutral. And public opinion is very supportive of this. They're very reluctant to give away their independence in this way. And they fear great powers. They fear big states. This is the opinion of the European Union on the accession of the 3 EFTA states. Austria, Sweden and Finland joined the EU in 1995. Before that, the EU makes an evaluation. If anyone applies, you get an evaluation on various criteria as to whether you're going to be a suitable candidate or not, whether you're actually going to join the club. And it's very rigorous. And the EU applies a lot of pressure to try and get a state to be shaped to how the EU sees itself and wants to run itself. In respect of these neutrals, they said the accession of the EFTA countries who have applied, Austria, Sweden, Finland and Switzerland had applied as well, shouldn't pose any problems of an economic nature and in fact would strengthen the community. But the question of neutrality and its compatibility with a common foreign and security policy is a particular concern. And the reason why was because in 1973 they said we're going to have a common defence. That's ultimately our aim for the completion of this European identity. And if you're neutral, you can't sign up to a common defence and an Article 5 guarantee. So if you want to join the EU, you're going to have to get rid of your neutrality. And the government said, well, we can't get rid of our neutrality because if we want to join the EU, we have to have a referendum. And if we tell the people that we have to get rid of neutrality, they're going to say no. And all of the data, public opinion data indicated that. So the Swedes were saying, we'd rather not join the EU if we have to give up our neutrality and join a military alliance. So this, what Robert Putnam calls a two-level game, started, where the government was being told by the bigger states in the EU, if you want to join, you have to eventually sign up to a common defence, become a member of NATO, agree to the merger of the Western European Union with the European Union, take on that Article 5 guarantee, whereas they couldn't tell that to their publics, because the publics would disagree, and through the referendums they had a power of veto, so those states wouldn't have joined. And there were a significant amount of economic interest, business interest, lobby groups who were pushing their governments to join. And there was a hidden, relatively unacknowledged, but significant lobby group of the defence industries, particularly in Sweden as well, who wanted membership of the EU because of the economic benefits, access to free market and so forth. But I remember I was being interviewed because we had a referendum in Ireland on the Lisbon Treaty, and I was being interviewed by the RTE, and they were asking me, well, what does the Lisbon Treaty mean for the Irish people? And I said, well, we're going to join a military alliance, we're going to take on a mutual defence clause, our neutrality is over. And they said, what? No, that's not the case. The government assured us. I said, well, yes, the government assured us that military neutrality would be protected, but that's not neutrality. Military neutrality was what happened when these states needed to join and have the referendum. They said, okay, we're going to whittle down our concept of neutrality. We're going to forget about the power politics. We're going to forget about sympathy for decolonising nations. We're going to forget about anti-big power politics, anti-aggression policies, not supporting defence industries in most of these cases and so forth. We're going to forget about all that stuff. And we're going to narrow it down to simply being non-members of a military alliance. Because technically that's okay, because we haven't actually joined a military alliance yet, even though it's coming down the road. It's not actually in this treaty. Say, this is up to the Treaty on European Union. So they said, look, military neutrality is safeguarded, and that's pretty much what the discourses on the referendum said. And it's important because they then changed their neutrality definition again once the Constitution, which completed the merger of the EU and the WU, came along, because that mutual defence clause was in the Lisbon Treaty. But as I said, RTE were asking me, well, what's significant? I said, well, we're taking on a mutual defence clause, and it's in Article 42, sub-point 7 of the Lisbon Treaty. And by the way, this was always going to happen because the European Commission said so when neutral states were going to join. And she said, the Commission said so, the EU said so. I said, yeah, it's in their opinion on the neutrals. She said, that's very controversial. Oh, I can't broadcast that. I said, well, it may be controversial, but it's the truth. She said, no. I said, well, I'll send you the reports. So what I do is I tend to present the actual reports rather than people thinking that I'm making this up. In Ireland, this was highly controversial to say, and in fact, they cut it out of the broadcast. But this was the Commission's opinion on Finland's application. Now, Austria had applied first in '89, and then Sweden had applied, and then Finland had applied. But when Austria applied in '89, the Commission had already delivered its opinion and said, you have to get rid of neutrality. Redefine it, whittle it down, but it has to go. So they changed it. Finland came along and it was the last of the three to post its application. It had already redefined it by the time it had submitted its application, knowing that this was something that they'd have to do anyway. And this is taken into account in the Commission opinion. It said that the Finnish policy of neutrality isn't rooted in law, national or international, and it's less developed than the others, and there's not much of a legal basis for it. So, leaving all that aside, it anticipated effects, even if they are of a political nature, that can pose problems for the Union, to the extent that they might cause Finland to oppose itself systematically to certain actions which, in its view, could be prejudicial to its policy of neutrality, or what is left of it. That's significant there, or what is left of it, because they knew they'd already redefined it to meaning non-membership of a military alliance. So it said the community would need, in the context of the accession negotiations, i.e., we're in these negotiations, you're not in the door yet, you're going to have to do this, to ascertain further the full nature of the present Finnish policy in order to be satisfied that it would not hamper the possible evolution in time of a common European defence, the Article 5 guarantee. As the Commission already pointed out in its report on the enlargement of the three, Specific and binding assurances will be sought from applicant countries with regard to their political commitment and legal capacity to fulfil the obligations of the common foreign and security policy, because Austria has neutrality enshrined in its constitution of 1955, so they would have to change their constitution, and that would register with public opinion. So this was the view of the EU. Neutrality is the other to who we are. We need you to become part of NATO, and to do that, you're going to join the Western European Union. So this is the Western European Union. Very briefly, the Brussels Treaty Organization was founded in 1948, and it had a collective defence clause in Article 5. So it was enlarged then to, it had 5 at the beginning: UK, France, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, and it enlarged to include Germany and Italy in 1954, and it became the Western European Union at that point. And the states undertook this mutual defence guarantee. So if any of the high contracting parties should be the object of an armed attack in Europe, the other parties will, in accordance with the provisions of Article 51 of the Charter of the UN, afford the party so attacked all the military and other aid and assistance in their power. So this is the WU's Article 5, which the neutrals are going to have to sign up to. But NATO overshadowed the WEU. The Washington Treaty was signed in 1949. And the reason why NATO was actually created, instead of just enlarging the WEU and changing its name and incorporating the US and Canada, was because the US, and particularly Congress, was very sensitive to this Article 5 guarantee. Because if the US signed up to all the aid and assistance in their power, they'd have to send the whole kit and caboodle across the Atlantic. Your military, your navy, your army, your air force, all of the military is going to have to go, because that's what it meant. So the US was, negotiators were saying to Britain in particular, who was pushing for this, we need to be able to decide ourselves what we send. And that's why the Article 5 guarantee in the Washington Treaty actually stipulates that. The US decides, or at least the members in that organization decide what to send. But this is going to become relevant a little bit later on. So that's the difference. You can decide yourself if you're a member of NATO. You could send a good luck card, or you could send your entire military. But the decision is yours to make. Anyway, so as I said, we have referendums in Ireland because of our constitution. The European Union created a constitution in 2004, and there were referendums held. 8 countries had already said, we're going to hold a referendum on it because of legitimacy, democracy, and so forth. And of those 8, France held one, and Holland held one, the Netherlands. And the public rejected the constitution. And if one state rejects the constitution or any of these treaties coming from the EU, the treaty falls. It cannot be ratified because it's legally required that all member states sign up to it. So it's dead in the water. Luxembourg said yes, and Spain said yes. But they had to stop there because, as they said, France was a founding member. It's a very large state. We can't ignore their public opinion. Holland is also one of the original 6. We're not going to ignore their opinion. However, as I said, a group of wise men were convened to figure out what to do next. Giuliano Amato was the head of this group, and they proposed changing all of the previous treaties: Treaty of Rome, Single European Act, Treaty on European Union, Amsterdam Treaty, Nice Treaty. They were all amending the original treaties. They said, look, we'll just put all of this stuff in the Constitution into an amended treaty. Now, it made it over 200 pages long and very difficult to figure out what was actually going on in the text, but that's what they produced, the Lisbon Treaty. Now, as I said, there's 27 member states now because we have the Eastern enlargement that happened in 2004. So we're in 2007, and they've done all the amendments, and they have the Lisbon Treaty. So it was signed in December 2007. Of the 27 member states, only one is legally obliged to have a referendum, but the others could have a referendum. None of the governments decided to have a referendum. They decided to ratify it through the Parliament, which had my mind questioning democracy promotion, rule of law, your right to decide on something very fundamental to the future of your state through signing up to the Constitution/Lisbon Treaty. But in Ireland, we had to have a referendum. So the government decided to set up a referendum commission. Now, we've always had referendum commissions since somebody who's an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, Patricia McKenna, took the government to court. She took them to court because she said they ran a very unfair campaign and they were biased, and a lot of the no campaigners didn't get any airtime. So anyway, the High Court agreed with her, and the Supreme Court agreed with her. So there was a Referendum Act, which meant that both sides had to get equal times. The government created this Referendum Commission, which would take the arguments from both sides, produce something, and then hand it out to people to inform themselves. But they changed the terms of reference for this particular body, for the Lisbon Treaty. They were no longer to take arguments from both sides, but they were to come up with their own facts of what is in the treaty. And the treaty wasn't distributed as it normally is either. It's very difficult to read, and you would have had to read it online, and it would take you about 5 hours to try to figure out your first reading of it, because it's over 200 pages long. So if you don't have internet access and you have a life, chances are you're probably not going to go and actually look at this document. So they came up with this simplified version of what's in the treaty. And in relation to the security and defence policy provisions, they did say there is mutual assistance in this treaty. Okay, so Irish people are probably not going to want to sign up to the mutual defence clause, but they say, look, there's mutual assistance. And they say the type of aid and assistance that is required is not specified, which I think is problematic, because it does specify by all means in your power, which is significant because that's why NATO was created. Anyway, the mutual assistance clause is also said not to compromise the specific character of the security and defence policy of certain member states, which includes Ireland's policy of neutrality. Well, that's okay then. Only the problem was it didn't say that. It actually went on to say that what's in this clause is going to be compatible with NATO, not with neutrality. So really, when you compare what they said with the actual clause, this is it, this is Article 42, subpoint 7, it does say that it doesn't prejudice the specific character of the security and defence policy of certain member states, but that was only put in there because the Irish government had objected to how this clause ended up in the treaty when it went to negotiate with the other member states about the final draft of the constitution. The Irish government said, well, we can't sign up to the mutual defence clause. Irish people won't actually allow this. They'll vote no in the referendum. And by the way, we're the only state to have a referendum. So we have to change this. So what happened was France, Germany and Britain said, look, we've been telling you this from the beginning. And we really want this because this is going to be the finalisation of our identity. You're going to have to sign up to it. So what do you need? We'll give you the Irish clause, which is what that clause is known as. But that's it. You're going to have to make do with that in your referendum discourse. So effectively, when you compare these two, in terms of what the Irish people were told, they more or less added in a clause to the treaty, which isn't there, which says that it protects Irish neutrality, and they more or less deleted that bit about NATO, how it has to be compatible with NATO, which is a problem, I suppose, in terms of what people are going to vote on. The European Commission also had a guide to the Lisbon Treaty, again for distribution in Ireland. But remarkably, and this is the interpretation of the Lisbon Treaty by José Manuel Barroso, it's going to allow the EU to become an external actor. It contains a mutual defence clause and a solidarity clause. It will allow a true common European defence to emerge, and it will allow the EU to shape globalisation. Well, what did they say in the guide for the Irish people? They actually left out the mutual defence clause. They didn't mention it at all in their guide. So in a way, my argument here is if the EU supports democracy, the rule of law, human rights and so forth, it hasn't gone about it, I believe, in terms of what it was telling the Irish people in order to make sure that they got this Constitution/Lisbon Treaty passed. So I put in the mutual defence clause there. And the Commission itself said this is really important. This is the culmination of many years of trying to have this clause in here, but they didn't include it in their guide. So effectively, the reason why they didn't put it in is because if you look at the research, Irish people have always rejected treaties because of neutrality. And in the Lisbon Treaty referendum, they also rejected it. And neutrality was the most divisive issue. So there were no campaigners saying it's going to end our neutrality once and for all. And here's the research that the Department of Foreign Affairs and the European Commission undertook, which said that the no vote was a product of complex combination of factors, included attitudes to Ireland's membership of the EU, our identity and neutrality. But in fact, neutrality was the top substantive policy reason. It always has been. And this is a regression analysis which tries to control for all other factors that are behind a no vote. And if you look at the fourth one there, strengthening neutrality is the substantive policy reason. Lack of knowledge is number one. Issues about the EU being a good thing and to do with internal politics about supporting the opposition party. But in terms of policy, neutrality is up there, number 4. The economy is quite in the middle there. Workers' rights is right down the bottom, but this is what was highlighted in the rerun of the referendum. So anyway, the EU told the Irish government to hold another referendum in Ireland. Unlike what happened with France and the Netherlands, we had to have a second referendum to get the right answer this time. So these were the posters that were part of the campaign. Because between 2008, when we held the first referendum, and 2009, when we held the second referendum, the Irish economy completely collapsed. The Irish banking system collapsed, and we went from about 3.5% unemployment to 12%, right, within a few months. So about 20,000 people a week were losing their jobs. And more or less what they said was, you have a choice between ruin and recovery. So if you actually want the Irish economy to recover and you want to retain your job, you have to vote yes to the Lisbon Treaty. And the government had a policy of not actually discussing the contents of the treaty, but focusing on the benefits of the European Union. And in the second referendum, they focused on the fact that the Irish economy had collapsed. So these were the posters that they came up with. And because women and young people in particular were extremely strong no voters, they came up with some more entertaining ads to appeal to the younger voter, which had a good impact. Increase your prospects, vote yes to the Lisbon Treaty. Enlarge your opportunities, vote yes to the Lisbon Treaty. So it was good marketing. You got to give it to them. Anyway, so it was passed. It was passed. Okay, so what I want to show you then is that in passing the Lisbon Treaty, we signed up to the Mutual Defence Clause. So the Lisbon Article 42.7 allowed the transfer of this collective defence clause. And that means there would be an end to neutrality. And academics had acknowledged it in the mid-1990s. So this is the flag of the WEU. It was terminated. Once the Lisbon Treaty was ratified in December 2009, a few months later, at the end of March, they terminated the WEU because its functions had been transferred. It was finished. So that did mean, though, that really our neutrality is finished because the WEU is now redundant. It's been absorbed into the EU. The EU has taken on all its competences. And it's said there, Article 42.7 has set out that if there's a victim of armed aggression, that all the others must provide them aid and assistance by all means in their power. They deleted the word military because that would have been problematic for the Irish referendum. So they basically, that's how they got this mutual defence clause in terms of its meaning. So they terminated it and made it really part of the EU. Okay, so this tells us something about the EU and its principles. Prodi says that these principles have inspired our union. He talks about ethical principles, diversity, persuasion, not coercion. Again, Gordon had talked about these. He also said, Solana, ours is not a common foreign policy. It's a common policy. It's not a single policy. We haven't set out to replace the 15 national ministries. They have an external action service for that now. So in a way, they actually have. But he's arguing that we need to find ways of pursuing shared aims in a way that gives real added value. And the argument always was that neutrals could provide the EU with some very good abilities to resolve conflicts in states where there is a colonial past from any of the big powers like France or Germany. But neutrality obviously was, I suppose, of lesser importance than the completion of the European identity and the transfer of the Mutual Defence Clause. So those qualities in a way are lost, I think. And this, to me, it contradicts what Solana is saying, that it's not a single policy. We allow diversity. The other of neutrality was not allowed. And he said, and again, Gordon had talked about this, we want to use the force of ideas and persuasion, not coercion. We've moved away from realpolitik. And our concept of power is the power of rules. So I'm questioning that, really. So what I'm going to do is very briefly now, because I'm coming to the end of my time, but we have a set of elements of the foreign policy that I want to look at. And one of these is in relation to operations in Africa. So if you look at this key here, in blue you have civilian missions, and in green you have military operations. So in terms of Europe, the predominant color there is blue, civilian, yeah. In Africa, it's a little more green. And those military operations are probably the more interesting ones. So we're going to have a look at some of them. In terms of whether the human security concept is part of the EU in how it conducts itself, and the UN Security Council resolutions in terms of gender mainstreaming, and finally the civil-military idea, which is a unique selling proposition that the EU has come across and promotes as part of its identity. What's human security? It's an approach to security that emphasizes the protection of individuals rather than territorial defense. The gender dimension is about paying attention in the rules of engagement to the fact that a large influx of peacekeepers or conflict resolution people or soldiers will actually create a market for trafficking of women. And that this must be acknowledged as part of the concept of human security. And there has to be a sexual code of conduct for the deployed personnel. Because if you remember, there was a scandal with UN peacekeepers who were running brothels and so on and so forth in the Balkans. So this came out of the UN Security Council resolutions, and the EU came up with an EU policy on women, peace and security, and they were going to try to implement this 1325 resolution and the 1820 resolution, which is linked to that. It says that sexual violence is a tactic of war. That's what 1820 brought in. So the 1325 came out in 2000, and the 1820 came about a little bit later in 2008. So is the EU implementing these? The civilian crisis management, as I said, is particular to the EU. It has no equivalent parallel in the UN, the OSCE, and is considered by many as the comparative advantage of the EU's external image. So, have they implemented it? Well, I've looked at all of the research in relation to this. It doesn't tend to be published in journals in relation to the European Union. It tends to be published in journals that are focused on Africa. And Olsen, in 2009, evaluated motivations for ESDP missions in Africa. He looked at Artemis, and he said, first and foremost, it was an attempt to prove that ESDP was viable because EU was divided after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Secondly, it was to show that France was a military power capable of acting separate from NATO. And thirdly, it was to portray the UK as being interested in ESDP, because the UK traditionally wanted to preserve the special relationship with the US, and that was why that second clause was added into the Lisbon Treaty, protecting, making sure that whatever happens under Article 42.7 is complementary to NATO. What about the Congo? Well, the EU's desire to bolster the credibility of ESDP after the rejection of the Constitution was the first and foremost motive. To demonstrate Franco-German cohesion was the second, and to serve as a political testing ground for the EU to design forms of intervention. And it's argued by Olsen the actual situation on the ground in the Democratic Republic of Congo was only a secondary factor. But it was still a factor, and at least the EU is acting, but we want to look at the motivations for it in terms of this normative power Europe. In Chad in 2008, the first one was to portray the EU as an ethical power in relation to Darfur. George Clooney was talking about Darfur. Darfur was big in the media, so it was good for the EU to act as an independent international conflict manager. Secondly, to portray the EU missions as purely humanitarian in the run-up to the referendum in Ireland in 2008. However, there were second-order concerns that were to do with the plight of the refugees in the camps and the protection of the aid workers, which was the purpose of that mission. So, you know, while I'm not trying to be critical about the EU, we're just trying to look at what those motivations were. Finally, the European Parliament said what makes the situation particularly delicate is that the mission has to demonstrate its neutrality vis-à-vis French troops, because Chad was basically run by the French military. There was about 4,000 troops deployed, and about 2,000 of them came from France. So I think generally, so far, the motives are not necessarily primarily normative and humanitarian, but a little bit about power politics. What about aid and democracy promotion in Africa? Again, the research has noted that they compared US aid with French aid to see which was the more normative. Interesting question. Both of them had strategic concerns where they actually implemented their aid. Civil and political rights only mattered once it was in an area of no particular strategic value. So it was primary if there was no strategic value, and secondary if it was. But it did say that the American aid was more ethical and motivated by the issue of political rights than the French aid. And more or less, they argued that it was never really going to work because the democracy agenda was literally tagged on to the partnership design at the bequest of the European Parliament. The two states that are best placed to promote it, France and Spain, weren't actually interested in democracy promotion. And the EU really is seen as a clearinghouse for national interests rather than a unitary actor. So if it's just simply for France to promote its interests through ESDP or Britain to promote its interest in ESDP, it's probably not going to work in terms of an ethical power. And the actual practice in terms of the aid distribution to support democracy, it basically went to government-linked groups rather than ordinary people. So it wasn't very sustainable in that respect. Support for civil society didn't in practice extend to ordinary people. Civil society was considered to be liberal groups rather than Islamic or religious groups, so they did not get any funding. And it argued that the EU could be more vigorous when it's faced with violations, such as the detention of human rights defenders. But then it went on to say, well, the EU has to take a softly approach because France and Britain and others like Italy and Spain are neo-colonial powers that some of these African states in North Africa have only recently got their independence, a bit like Ireland, within living memory. And so therefore they cannot go in with a big fist. They have to take it softly. But then the question arises for me is, well then why did you get rid of neutrality? Why have you erased that neo-colonial post-independence impulse that was behind the foreign policies of Austria, Sweden, Finland and Ireland? So what about human security? Well, 7 principles were embodied in the human security approach, including the primacy of human rights. And in a follow-up report, the EU said that it was asked of the EU to make a public declaration in favour of 6 principles of human security and for a civilian to be overseeing military missions, which is a difficult thing in terms of implementation. What happened was the European Parliament Committee on Foreign Affairs more or less voted down all of the reference in relation to human security. So it wasn't actually implemented. They did say that they wanted to look at options for setting up integrated civil military response force, which is part of the EU's unique selling proposition. A sympathetic think tank said that actually the EU's got quite a poor performance as a civilian power. In practice, this idea of providing the diplomats and police officers is largely illusory, mainly because they are taking them away from like the police within the state. And the state actually needs those police forces. And then the gender dimension. This was one of the areas where the EU really wanted to promote itself. So in 2006, the Council asked Member States what steps they had taken to implement 1325. In 2006, of the 27, 3 states had devised them. A few of them were looking towards getting one off the ground. Denmark, Sweden, and UK had them, but Italy, Austria, Finland, and the Netherlands were working towards them. So we have 20 with no known progress. By this year, though, only 9 had actually put one together. So this is 10 years after the event, and we still have 9 out of 27 who have a national action plan in relation to the implementation of 1325. Trafficking is one of the most, I suppose, heinous aspects of gender-based violence, and it's argued by researchers that the EU is in denial because the Swedish diplomat who was responsible for trying to get it on the agenda of the EU was met with responses like, well, it's not a problem we have with our forces. And a senior military official at the European Command in the Balkans who had extensive experience there from 96 to 2000 said that the Human Trafficking Evaluation Project was basically an example of government waste, fraud and abuse. So he was not supportive of this. And they did actually send a marine lawyer in as a gender person, but he didn't know anything about human trafficking except what he actually learned off the internet the night before. So again, the actual implementation of this leaves a lot to be desired. Catherine Ashton in September said that the Commission would put in place training modules on gender and crisis management, but so far they haven't actually been implemented. So again, I think there's a bit of a blot on the copybook. So finally then, to wrap up, the civilian crisis management and the CivMil concept. This is supposed to be where the EU will have police officers to go in to post-conflict regions to try to set up, again, a working police force, to get the public to trust the police, to train the police in terms of policing norms, to set up a justice system, to install judges and to train them, to train lawyers to be able to evaluate cases, criminal cases that come from conflict. And this was supposed to be their unique selling point, but it is being seen as a way to back up military crisis management rather than a good in itself. And it's argued that training should be compatible with NATO, OSCE and UN requirements and also for ESDP requirements, but that's a real stretch from peacekeeping all the way through to peace enforcement, which can be seen as ultimately war making. And none of the big five had really put together crisis management in any serious way. None of the big five states of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Then the Council put forward the concept of civil-military coordination, so CMCO, and this is supposed to be a culture of coordination between civilian and military people who are putting together these missions, and it's supposed to be seen as to the credibility of the EU as a crisis manager, and it has a very decisive impact, therefore, on the future of the EU in this respect. However, the way it's been set up now in terms of the committees within the council structure, effectively there's two chains of command. And the culture of trying to break down the barriers between civil and military have not actually occurred. So again, a bit of a blot on the copybook there. So to conclude, so far we've had in the literature a discourse that the EU is a normative power, it's a soft power actor, it's a civilian power actor. However, there's academic work that has empirically evaluated this against policy developments and evidence, and they're arguing the EU is more appropriately described as non-normative, realist and hard power actor, and that it's changed its character away from a civilian power actor. So what I'm arguing is, and I looked at this from a critical constructivist perspective, to look at what the EU did internally in terms of othering neutrality, othering other states within its identity. And I'm arguing there's a tension between this idea of the EU being a normative power actor that is constructed in the discourses on the one hand, and then not only the practices of ESDP that I've looked at, but this split identity internally for me is the key. Because if the EU is not willing to promote democracy, uphold human rights and the rule of law internally with respect to the conduct in relation to the completion of the EU identity and defence, then what hope does it have of acting externally in this manner? The EU desires this role as a global actor. Does it do it for realist purposes of power protection balancing and the protection of interests, or is it for normative reasons, such as the realisation of its values? And I guess I'm questioning that. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so we have some time for questions for Dr. Devine. So please, we'll pass the mic around so that our comrades at Ferris State University can hear what question is being asked.
Did the economic problems that were during the second thing of the Lisbon Act, did they actually get any better, or was it just kind of a coincidence that they used?
Can you hear me? What happened was unemployment continued to increase. So it was around 12.5% at the time of the referendum. It's now about 13.75% going up to 14%. I wouldn't necessarily say that it had any impact in terms of the economy. It's not related to foreign direct investment. What happened was that I think it was the head of the US Chamber of Commerce in Ireland came out and said that US companies would not invest in Ireland if Ireland didn't pass the Lisbon Treaty. And this has been a theme of referendum debates, whereas before Jack Welch had retired, he was chairman of General Electric, he was asked, well, say for example, if Ireland wants to uphold its neutrality during the Iraq War and forbids US flights to land at Shannon if they are going to the theatre of war, in other words, aiding the war, would you withdraw your investment? And he said, no, we invest in Ireland because of the low corporate tax rate, which is 12, I think, at 0.5%, and because of the educated workforce, because you're English speaking, and because you're members of the European Union, we have access to European markets through you, and those are the reasons why we invest, and it has nothing to do with your foreign policy, and it never really will be. We'll stay in there if it's profitable for us to do so, but otherwise, your foreign policy is your own business. But it is a rhetorical device used. And there's also an issue in that the European Commission has fined, for example, Microsoft over 500 million because it more or less contravened competition law. And what happened was even Michael O'Leary of Ryanair ended up campaigning for the Lisbon Treaty. He doesn't even know what's in the Lisbon Treaty, but because... Am I holding this wrong?
Could you just clip it on your lapel?
Sorry.
Thank you.
But because Michael O'Leary runs an airline company, and he wanted to have basically the Commission to give him a break in relation to a merger between Aer Lingus, the state airline company, and Ryanair, he needs the Commission to be on his side. An awful lot of prominent business people started supporting the treaty, really so that they could be in the good books of the Commission, because the Commission was desperate for this treaty to go through. Obviously, it had been rejected in France and the Netherlands. They had gone through this 2 years of revising it. So they needed to get the arguments out there. And in terms of the fact that the Irish economy had gone down the tubes, it was the best option.
The question I would like to ask you, I'm Francois Frey, I'm from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Some of the reading that I did on this whole matter, and that this pertains particularly to the strategic culture of the European Union, was that there was an approach that, there's not the expectation that everybody is going to jump onto the bandwagon, for example, when an operation is undertaken into Africa. Countries that commit themselves undertake the operation, and countries who feel they are not comfortable with this, they do not participate, and that you have a type of an incremental approach that could even peter out that says, if things go well, we can join you. And if I listen to your presentation, I get the impression that either my interpretation of this was wrong, or things have moved quite substantially away from this incremental approach of everybody is not going to be in step perfectly as the whole process of taking this forward advances.
So in terms of the singularness of the policy, in terms of missions, the EU is not expecting every member state to contribute to a mission or to be happy about the launch of a mission. Is that your point? Yeah. There is exactly that mechanism is in the Lisbon Treaty, because what they introduced was something called constructive abstention. Constructive abstention is where a state will, when they're at the council table, when, say, for example, if France wants to intervene, or one of the big powers wants to put together a mission and they have the capabilities to do so, and they want to label it an EU mission, it was actually designed for the neutrals. It was designed for the neutrals at the time of the Amsterdam Treaty in relation to foreign policy, but not in relation to defence policy. And in Lisbon, they brought it in for defence policy. So neutral states and other smaller states who might not want to get involved, or other bigger states who don't want to get involved, don't have to get involved. But there is a mechanism whereby if they say, they don't have to say no, because decisions have to be taken unanimously. So every member state, all 27 states, have to agree. So rather than have smaller states who really don't want to get involved and don't feel it's part of their remit, rather than saying no and the mission never happening, they can abstain. And this has been introduced for the first time in defence in the Lisbon Treaty. So this allows smaller states not to get involved. So there is what they call variable geometry there. There is opt-outs in that respect. And in a way there's an opt-in, which the neutrals disagreed with because they felt that, you know, you're creating a Eurozone of defence. It's a bit like some countries are in the Euro and others are not. And there is that force of, we want to be part of it. I mean, a big discourse in Ireland was, in terms of the referendum, was whether Ireland would lose interest, and being at the heart of Europe was a big theme in the discourse. And there's this idea of permanent structured cooperation, whereby states will cooperate to basically build up their arms, build up their capabilities. We're missing, for example, at the European level, strategic lift capabilities. So the US provides that all the time. The French wanted to have that in the agenda. The French had the presidency in 2009 of the EU, and this was what they were pushing for. One of the things they wanted was strategic lift capability. And under permanent structured cooperation, they're going to have a club of states. And I think it was a colleague of Nicolas Sarkozy in his political party who floated this idea of the Eurozone for defence. So you basically join permanent structured cooperation in order to coordinate with others so that you can undertake, and I quote, the most demanding military missions. So the most demanding military missions mean the hard end of what we call the Petersburg task, the peace enforcement and peacemaking. But if you decide you want to actually get involved at a later stage, you have to basically, well, your name's not down at the door. You haven't joined the club in the beginning, and so the other member states who are in permanent structured cooperation will have to make a decision as to whether you are now allowed into permanent structured cooperation. So permanent structured cooperation, which is in the Lisbon Treaty, is a mechanism by which there is this elite club that will undertake the most demanding military missions. Others are outside of it. If you want to suddenly get involved, you're going to have to join the club. But there's an inbuilt bias in that if you don't join at the beginning, which neutral states in particular would be reluctant to, it's going to be difficult for you to get involved. Does that sort of answer a bit of what you're thinking? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Karen, I have a question regarding the U.S. government's response to the European Union's common security and defense policy. Does the U.S. government reacted to this as something that might negate NATO or form as a liability to NATO, or as something that could potentially bolster NATO, or if they just recognize it as an issue of politics and European identity? And then finally, has there been a change in position from the U.S. government between the Bush administration and the Obama administration?
Yeah, great question. Because the US has always been the external other for the EU. It was the French foreign minister at the time, Hubert Védrine, who said, a Europe puissance, a powerful Europe, is in the interests of the USA. And he was responding to, in a way, the neoconservatives who argue that we want to withdraw from Europe. The peace dividend of the end of the Cold War is there. We shouldn't have to have as many bases in Germany. We don't have to have as many nuclear weapons. I think there's about 250 in that eastern zone. We need to be able to, lower our costs in terms of managing these. We need to withdraw our troops. And so we want Europe to start taking on the burden of its own defense. So in one aspect, there's a demand that the Europeans spend more than 2% of their GDP on defense. The US is normally around sort of 4%. And in the 80s, the UK and the US were spending up to 8%. So European countries have tended to drop their defense expenditure, obviously, and again, it's not talked about much in the literature, but there is an aspect of the military-industrial complex underpinning this. Arms industry is a very significant lobbyist and player in the European area. And so I do think, though, that in some ways the attitude is schizophrenic. So the neoconservative aspect of the US does want Europe to share its burden, but the problem is, and Madeleine Albright under Clinton had the 3 Ds. She had an issue with ESDP. She didn't want duplication of NATO assets, effectively. She didn't want the EU doing something that NATO does already. And they didn't want Europe to start going off into Africa without them. They didn't want Europe to have the ability to go and, say, have a reaction to the invasion of Iraq, to end up at a point whereby, if there is a Europe puissance, that puissance, that power might be used, and it might not be in the US interests. So there's always been this tension and schizophrenic attitude that we hear coming from the US over to Europe in that you need to arm yourselves, you need to take on the burden within NATO, but you can't do anything outside of NATO. And the French have always wanted to do stuff outside of NATO. Traditionally, they've wanted to basically be able to be a power apart from the US. And so for all sorts of reasons. And so there's always that tension. Did it change from Bush to Obama? I think the fact that when Bush invaded Iraq, that gave a huge impetus to ESDP that the EU elite harnessed, because if you looked at opinion polls, a majority of public opinion was against the invasion of Iraq in Europe. Even the political parties and the governments within Europe were split over it. Obviously the UK was in favour, Germany was against, France was against. And so when Obama came in, they felt that, well, at least we're probably not going to be faced with an invasion. I mean, I know Syria is on the agenda, Iran's on the agenda, but they don't believe that Obama is as interventionist as Bush has been. So in a way, that impetus has been taken away. The need for a Europe puissance to stand up against American policy is gone if Obama actually implements a foreign policy seen as more reflective of a European view on tackling conflict. So we'll see. Watch this space. Yeah.
Time for one more quick question.
We have a few minutes.
Thanks, great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks.
I was wondering if constructivists would accept the idea that these values from which everything starts, right, are they also part of the political process? And then could the European Union or anybody else who likes to adopt the process of othering, could it say, well, in this particular situation, we define this value as a result of our political interest as such, and then perhaps in a different situation, we define it as such. And all of that basically comes within the notion of how we define democracy in the European Union. And when I say we, means the dominant countries of the European Union. Or would that be too close to neorealism and would just then the whole intention of normative power Europe disappear?
Yeah. It's interesting in terms of the theoretical justification for values being, in a way, an independent variable of themselves, that they exert a force independent of interests. And to try to actually pin that down in terms of research is very difficult. The theory that I borrow from is basically political psychology or social psychology, in that the very basic premises of coming to take on an identity, it actually happens when you take on values. You know who you are by what you stand for. And so a lot of my research, my empirical research, when I analyze public opinion on neutrality, I try to look at the values that underpin an attitude in favor of against neutrality. So for example, if somebody is strongly supportive of neutrality, the two values that underpin that are patriotism and independence. So the prouder you are of being Irish, the more likely you are to support neutrality. The more you want to hang on to your independence, the more you will want to support neutrality, which goes to the values of what you stand for. And as an Irish person, it's, not trying to kick the bejesus out of other people, trying to be non-aggressive and having our country for ourselves, being independent that way, that's part of the Irish identity. So, it's an empirically fascinating thing that if you wanted to understand why people support a foreign policy, you would look at how patriotic they are. But that's identity. And so values, I think, are, through the root of social psychology and political psychology, I think we can argue for it. I know Wendt doesn't go into that area, and that's where I think the critical perspective of constructivism can add value. But I think there needs to be a lot more testing of it. I mean, I tested it in an article in International Political Science Review in 2008, and they came up as these two predictors. But I haven't really seen any other research that has actually operationalized your identity as in your national identity and the type of values that you actually adhere to. So again, we'll see how the research agenda develops.
This is the way of the future, I think.
Maybe. I don't think it works in all cases, though, because ultimately we're in this postmodern situation whereby we're not fighting to put food on the table. We can just about hopefully get a job and sustain our living arrangements. Whereas I think if you're in a war situation and you're looking at, your life and your peril, then obviously interests are foremost rather than identity. You're gonna plump for looking after yourself rather than having an identity that is a globally focused one that wants to help decolonizing nations and is standing up for the small person, like the Palestinians, for example. That's always been the Irish identity, looking after the other subjugated others. So we'll see.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Devine.
Great.